In Gauteng, the province's Social Development Department is hosting the Gauteng Provincial NPA Summit to try and improve the relationship between NGOs, civil society groups and the provincial government. Earlier this year, the Gauteng Provincial Government said it was going to slash the funding it gives to NPOs. They ended up waging a public campaign to retain the money they receive so they can provide care and help for people. Well, Lisa Vetten is a research associate at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits University. She's been conducting some research on this. Lisa, good afternoon to you. Firstly, if the Gauteng Department of Social Development went ahead and actually cut the amount of money it gives to these NGOs, what would happen not to the NGOs, but to the people who receive help and care from these NGOs?
It would be devastating. I mean, I think this province has lived through life esidimeni, and I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say we wouldn't see something similar. I mean, if we look at what happened in April, the organizations that care for people with spinal cord injuries who are entirely dependent on other people for their care, they lost all their funding, for example. Protective workshops, which are also important for people with disabilities, those were cut. Children's services dealing with child abuse, those two were also cut. So things like the foster care, the protection of children, removal of children, applications for children's safety in the courts, all that vanished. Feeding schemes for children, many feeding schemes for older persons, all vanished. So I mean, one could foresee a situation where you'd see many people losing perhaps the only meal that they have per day, and children being left in situations that were very unsafe. Because I think what was most concerning about this cut, which amounted to some 415 million rand, just to put that scale in perspective, was that there'd been no plans on the part of the Department of Social Development to take over those services. And I think there was another category of people who are also affected, and those are people who have committed petty crimes, and you would rather not want them to go to prison. You'd want them diverted out of the system. You wouldn't want to expose them to greater criminality within prison. Most of those services were cut. The only program for child sex offenders in the province was also cut. So, you know, that had another knock-on effect in terms of the fact that once people have criminal records and have gone to jail, they become very unemployable. So you would have inadvertently also been reinforcing those kinds of problems. So the cuts were wide-ranging, impacted a lot of different people, and had great potential for, I think, exacerbating social problems in Gauteng.
So the argument from the Department of Social Development, and there's several arguments they bring, but would they be able to then provide those services in the way that NGOs do? What would they do with the 400 million rand? Would they provide those services as efficiently as NGOs do?
No, they wouldn't, because what they did with that 400 million rand was that they shifted it to programs dealing with income and livelihoods. So there was no intent, they did not take that money in order to employ additional social workers to take over these services. And if you look at their staffing requirements, especially in the area of social welfare services, if you look at the number of staff that they have there, it is a fraction of the NPO staff. They would not have been able to take over those services. So they have said they would like to take over child protection. I think that's the wrong language. The idea is not to take over existing services. We do not have enough services in child protection as it is. So if the department takes over what exists, it means they're not expanding or growing the services in any way. Not only that, you've also got to take into account that Department of Social Development officials earn very much more than NGOs do. So just in terms of that kind of financial reality, fewer social workers will be available from Department of Social Development than you would see in the NGO sector. So you would actually see a shrinkage of services rather than an attempt to see where are there gaps, where should we fill in. You would actually see less services being provided. And our other guest, Lindi, who we lost from Tembisa Child Welfare, is an example of the kind of catastrophe that would have happened, is because the DSD has no offices in Tembisa. So if they had shut down Tembisa Child Welfare as they had proposed, it would have meant they would have imposed extra costs on people who would have had to have traveled out of Tembisa in order to go to the department's offices. I mean, you are talking about people who are already struggling, and now you want to give them extra financial burdens. Not only that, the department also doesn't know Tembisa. They don't have the history of being in that area for over 30 years. So, you know, it was not well thought out at all.
It was interesting to see how this played out, because clearly the department has some rationale for doing this. There are a couple of points to it, though. I'm presuming 400 million rand, that these NGOs would not be able to get this money from somewhere else. Even the middle class is probably tapped out as far as charity is concerned at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think what the department is not taking into account is that you have a very small pool of additional funding. If you suddenly have only 20 NGOs who were previously approaching that pool, and now you have 200, quite clearly there's not going to be the capacity. And I think what the department keeps forgetting is that this money is not for NGOs. It is actually for beneficiaries, people who need services. The NGO is merely the vehicle for providing the services. So when they say they're cutting funding, it means they're cutting funds to vulnerable people, not NGOs. And I think if we focus only on the fact that it's NGOs, we lose sight of the fact that these services are people's entitlements in terms of Section 27. They are entitled to these services, and they would be taking them away, which would be a rights violation, effectively.
If what you say is correct, and I'm sure it is, accept what you say, that the outcomes for the people who need help would be so much worse, why would the department want to go ahead and do this? And this, if I remember correctly, is not the first time they've proposed cutting funding to NGOs.
That is a question you'll have to ask the department. I mean, I think one must realize they do sit in a difficult position. Much of their justification for moving at 400 million was to try and create income and livelihood opportunities for young people. And, you know, that is a very important goal and a very important objective. You don't want a situation where your tax base, who are now in their 20s, are not able to be employed for the next 40 years. What is going to happen to your tax base, for example? So, yes, that is an important problem that they are trying to deal with. I think that we also acknowledge that the economy is in very poor shape and that things need to be done. However, you don't just cut funding and take it from one group of people in order to give it to another group of people. You need to do much more careful planning, and I think ask the question, who is responsible to be providing this kind of economic support? Not only that, have you done the kind of research that tells you the programs you want to put in place for incomes and livelihood are actually effective? Or are you just giving people money and playing at make jobs in order to try and create some pretense at employment for people? So there was not adequate thinking through. I mean, I think one of the difficulties with the department is if you ask them what kind of planning they've done to get a sense of how many older people there will be in the province over the next 5 to 10 years, and therefore how much frail care will be required, how much additional income support, how many more luncheon clubs, all those kinds of questions. That kind of projection and planning hasn't been done. So I think you can't just move funding if you haven't looked at that and thought about what will be the impact. And I must say, from some of the conversations we had with the officials in the department at the time, there was a great deal of division in the department. Some people very clearly saw the impact of what was going to happen, whereas others didn't. So I think you're going to need to ask the department about the internal dynamics that are playing out. And I mean, it's quite clear the Premier himself, when he stepped in, recognized the disaster that we were looking at if this went ahead.
So, Lisa, now there is this summit which is being hosted, as I understand it, by the Gauteng Provincial Government. Are they trying to mend fences and build bridges? Do you think that they're actually hearing what you're telling them?
Initially they weren't, and there was some very stiff opposition that went on yesterday to what they were doing, because I think the regional summits that they had prior to the provincial summit began, you are not getting more funding. You need to make a plan. And it also began on the note of, we are taking over child protection services. There's no indication of, well, how much are you cutting organizations by? What are your plans to take over the services? Well, it's very clear from the staff complement that you cannot do that and that you are not getting a massive injection from Treasury to do so. So I think they began, again, from that basis of, we're cutting services. And I think people were very angry about that. We pushed back, especially because there had been much of the documentation had been asked beforehand in order to prepare for the summit had not been prepared. So I think there was some jostling that went on, and by today there was an opening to make proper resolutions as to what needs to happen going forward. Like a proper audit of demand for services, so that you can do some rational planning for the next 5 to 10 years over what needs to happen. So I think today is just another step in what is clearly going to be a much longer process and a very much more difficult process around how we are going to ensure that vulnerable people across the province get services, and that you can also look at how do we create income support and livelihood support for people who are unemployed. So I think some very clever thinking has to happen. But this summit is not going to be able to solve it, but hopefully it will open up a dialogue that's going to be needed over the next 6 months.
Lisa Vetten, thank you. Research Associate at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits University.